What's up, YouTube? I'm making this video because I don't have a lot of subscribers, and maybe I don't have that many because I don't say subscribe enough. So in this video, I'm seeing how long I can say the word subscribe. Let's get straight into the video. 1 subscribe, 2 subscribe, 3 subscribe, 4 subscribe, 5 subscribe, 6 subscribe, 7 subscribe, 8 subscribe, 9 subscribe, 10 subscribe, 11 subscribe, 13 subscribe, 14 subscribe, 15 subscribe, 16 subscribe, 17 subscribe, 18 subscribe, 19 subscribe, 20 subscribe, 21 subscribe, 22 subscribe, 23 subscribe, 24 subscribe, 25 subscribe, 26 subscribe, 27 subscribe, 28 subscribe, 29 subscribe, 30 subscribe, 31 subscribe, 32 subscribe, 33 subscribe, 34 subscribe, 35 subscribe, 36 subscribe, 37 subscribe, 38 subscribe, 39 subscribe, 40 subscribe, 41 subscribe, 42 subscribe, 43 subscribe, 44 subscribe, 45 subscribe, 46 subscribe. 101 subscribe, 102 subscribe, 103 subscribe, 104 subscribe, 105 subscribe, 106 subscribe, 107 subscribe, 108 subscribe, 109 subscribe, 110 subscribe, 111 subscribe, 112 subscribe, 113 subscribe, 114 subscribe, 115 subscribe, 116 subscribe, 117 subscribe, 118 subscribe, 119 subscribe, 120 subscribe, 121 subscribe, 122 subscribe, 123 subscribe, 124 subscribe, 125 subscribe, 126 subscribe, 127 subscribe, 128 subscribe, 129 subscribe, 130 subscribe, 31 subscribe, 132 subscribe, 133 subscribe, 134 subscribe, 135 subscribe, 136 subscribe, 137 subscribe, 138 subscribe, 139 subscribe, 140 subscribe, 141 subscribe, 142 subscribe, 143 subscribe, 144 subscribe, 145 subscribe, 146 subscribe, 147 subscribe, 148 subscribe, 149 subscribe, 150 subscribe, 151 subscribe, 152 subscribe, 153 subscribe, 154 subscribe, 155 subscribe, 156 subscribe, 157 subscribe, 158 subscribe, 159 subscribe, 160 subscribe, 161 subscribe, 162 subscribe, 163 subscribe, 164 subscribe, 165 subscribe, 166 subscribe, 167 subscribe, 168 subscribe, 169 subscribe, 170 subscribe, 171 subscribe, 172 subscribe, 173 subscribe, 174 subscribe, 175 subscribe, 176 subscribe, 177 subscribe, 178 subscribe, 179 subscribe, 180 subscribe, 181 subscribe, 182 subscribe, 183 subscribe, 184 subscribe, 185 subscribe, 186 subscribe, 187 subscribe, 188 subscribe, 189 subscribe, 190 subscribe, 191 subscribe, 192 subscribe, 193 subscribe, 194 subscribe, 195 subscribe, 196 subscribe, 197 subscribe, 198 subscribe, 199 subscribe, 200. 400 subscribe, 401 subscribe, 402 subscribe, 403 subscribe, 404 subscribe, 405 subscribe, 406 subscribe, 407 subscribe, 408 subscribe, 409 subscribe, 410 subscribe, 411 subscribe, 412 subscribe, 413 subscribe, 414 subscribe, 415 subscribe, 417 subscribe, 418 subscribe, 419 subscribe, 420 subscribe, 421 subscribe, 422 subscribe, 423 subscribe, 424 subscribe, 425 subscribe, 426 subscribe, 427 subscribe, 428 subscribe, 429 subscribe, 430 subscribe, 431 subscribe, 432 subscribe, 433 subscribe, 434 subscribe, 435 subscribe, 436 subscribe, 437 subscribe, 438 subscribe, 439 subscribe, 440, 441 subscribe, 442 subscribe, 443 subscribe, 444 subscribe, 445 subscribe, 446 subscribe, 447 subscribe, 448 subscribe, 449 subscribe, 450 subscribe, 451 subscribe, 452 subscribe, 453 subscribe, 454 subscribe, 455 subscribe, 456 subscribe, 457 subscribe, 458 subscribe, 459 subscribe, 460, 461 subscribe, 462 subscribe, 463 subscribe, 464 subscribe, 465 subscribe, 466 subscribe, 457 subscribe, 458 subscribe, 459 subscribe, 460 subscribe, 461 subscribe, 462 subscribe, 463 subscribe, 464 subscribe, 465 subscribe, 456 subscribe, 457 subscribe, 458 subscribe, 459 subscribe, 460 subscribe, 461 subscribe, 462 subscribe, 463 subscribe, 464 subscribe, 465 subscribe, 466 subscribe, 457 subscribe, 458 subscribe, 459 subscribe, 460 subscribe, 461 subscribe, 462 subscribe, 463 subscribe, 464 subscribe, 465 subscribe, 466 subscribe, 457 subscribe, 458 subscribe, 459, 69 subscribe, 470 subscribe, 471 subscribe, 472 subscribe, 473 subscribe, 474 subscribe, 475 subscribe, 476 subscribe, 477 subscribe, 478 subscribe, 479 subscribe, 480 subscribe, 481 subscribe, 482 subscribe, 483 subscribe, 484 subscribe, 485 subscribe, 486 subscribe, 487 subscribe, 488 subscribe, 489 subscribe, 490 subscribe, 491 subscribe, 492 subscribe, 493 subscribe, 494 subscribe, 495 subscribe, 496 subscribe, 497 subscribe, 498 subscribe, 499 subscribe, 500. Just subscribe, 901 subscribe, 902 subscribe, 903 subscribe, 904 subscribe, 905 subscribe, 906 subscribe, 907 subscribe, 908 subscribe, 909 subscribe, 910 subscribe, 111 subscribe, 112 subscribe, 113 subscribe, 114 subscribe, 916 subscribe, 917 subscribe, 918 subscribe, 919 subscribe, 920 subscribe, 921 subscribe, 922 subscribe, 923 subscribe, 924 subscribe, 925 subscribe, 926 subscribe, 927 subscribe, 928 subscribe, 929 subscribe, 920 subscribe, 927, 20. What? Oh, 930 subscribe, 931 subscribe, 932 subscribe, 933 subscribe, 934 subscribe, 935 subscribe, 936 subscribe, 937 subscribe, 938 subscribe, 939 subscribe, 940 subscribe, 941 subscribe, 942 subscribe, 943 subscribe, 944 subscribe, 945 subscribe, 946 subscribe, 947 subscribe, 948 subscribe, 949 subscribe, 950 subscribe, 951 subscribe, 952 subscribe, 953 subscribe, 954 subscribe, 955 subscribe, 956 subscribe, 957 subscribe, 958 subscribe, 959 subscribe, 960 subscribe, 961 subscribe, 962 subscribe, 963 subscribe, 964 subscribe, 965 subscribe, 966 subscribe, 967 subscribe, 968 subscribe, 969 subscribe, 970 subscribe, 971 subscribe, 972 subscribe, 973 subscribe, 974 subscribe, 975 subscribe, 976 subscribe, 977 subscribe, 178 subscribe, 979 subscribe, 180 subscribe, 181 subscribe, 182 subscribe, 183 subscribe, 184 subscribe, 185 subscribe, 186 subscribe, 187 subscribe, 188 subscribe, 189 subscribe, 191 subscribe, 192 subscribe, 983 subscribe, 184 subscribe, 985 subscribe, 986 subscribe, 987 subscribe, 98 subscribe, 999 subscribe, 1,000 subscribe. Five 5,001 subscribe, 5,002 subscribe, 5,003 subscribe, 5,004 subscribe, 5,005 subscribe, 5,006 subscribe, 5,007 subscribe, I thought it was in As you can see, I fell asleep. If you like this video, I will start over, and hopefully I will be counting longer than I did this time. Don't forget to subscribe.